Sometimes you have layouts and designs where you require some space in between each of grid cell. Well, you can create some space using the margin property. So for example, if you want to add some spacing to this element, we target it in CSS and write in, for example, margin 10 pixels. Well, it is working, but all of what you're doing here is creating space around this individual cell. You're not dealing with how the grid is laid out. Fortunately, with CSS Grid layout, you have total control over the spaces or gutters between columns and rows. And that is using the grid row gap, the grid column gap, and the grid gap properties. And you set these properties on the grid container. So if you go to our grid container, then type in grid column gap and set a value of 15 pixels, you can notice that we have a 15 pixels gutter between column tracks. So let's try something like 20 pixels, and now we are having a gutter of 20 pixels between the column tracks. Let's move to the next property, which is the grid row gap. So here I'll type in grid row gap and set a value of 10 pixels. And now I just created a 10 pixels gutter between row tracks. If I set a value of 20 pixels, we will have a 20 pixels gutter between row tracks. There is also a shorthand property for the column and row gaps, and that is the grid gap. So if we remove these lines and type in grid gap, so the first value that you set will be for the grid row gap and the second value will be for the grid column gap. So let's choose 20 pixels for the row gap and 10 pixels for the column gap. Great. Let's try another value here. So you can see that it is working, and now if you only set one value, this value will be applied to both row gap and column gap. For instance, if you set a value of 20 pixels, we will have a row gap of 20 pixels and a column gap of 20 pixels at the same time.